The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the fields behind the house. Lena stood at the window, her hands resting lightly on the windowsill, watching as the day faded into evening. The scent of freshly mown grass and the earthy fragrance of the woods beyond the fence mixed in the air, stirring something deep inside her. It had been years since she felt alive in this way, her heart stirring at the sight of the distant hills. She had always felt grounded in this small town, tied to her family, her home, and her duties. But today there was something different, something she couldn't quite place. Jake, the young man who had been helping her father for the last few weeks, had a presence that filled the room whenever he was near. He was kind, patient, and more than anything, he was easy to talk to. But it wasn't just that. There was a way he looked at her, a glint in his eyes that made Lena question everything she thought she knew about herself. She was 57, not a young woman anymore, and yet when he gazed at her, there was no judgment, only a quiet admiration that made her feel something she hadn't in years. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. There was no room for such distractions in her life. Not at her age. Not with everything she had to take care of. Her father's health was deteriorating, and Lena had assumed the role of caretaker, just as she had promised her mother. The house, her responsibilities, and her aging father, these were the things that kept her rooted. There was no space for a man, especially not someone so young, with the world ahead of him. Yet, every time Jake entered the room, there was a subtle shift in the air. She couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened when he spoke, the way his touch lingered a second too long when he helped her with the groceries, or when he held the door open for her. It was all so small, so seemingly innocent. But it wasn't. She knew it deep down. "Lena," a soft voice called from the hallway, interrupting her thoughts. Lena turned to find Jake standing at the doorway, his smile warm, but his eyes unreadable. His hands were casually stuffed into the pockets of his worn jeans, but there was something about the way he stood there, as if waiting for her to say something. "Dinner's ready," he said, stepping inside. "Your dad's asking for you." Lena nodded, a little too quickly, perhaps. "I'll be right there." Jake lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting hers, as if expecting something more. The air seemed to thicken around them, but he turned and left without saying another word. Lena stood there for a moment, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't understand. He was just a caretaker, just a young man doing his job. She shouldn't be feeling this way. It wasn't right. But every time she saw him, the line between what was right and what she felt seemed to blur just a little more. As Lena entered her father's room, the scent of lavender and antiseptic hit her like a familiar embrace. George was sitting in his chair by the window, his frail body wrapped in a thick sweater, his eyes distant as he stared out at the rolling hills. He had always been so strong, so stubborn, and now, in his old age, he had become a shadow of the man he once was. Lena's heart ached as she approached him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "How are you doing today, Dad?" she asked softly, her voice laced with concern. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to communicate, the effects of his illness weighing heavily on his once vibrant spirit. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice low and raspy. "Just tired." Lena smiled faintly, brushing a lock of gray hair from his forehead. "Well, I brought you some dinner. Jake made it for you." George's eyes flickered for a moment, and he let out a soft grunt. "Jake's a good boy, but he's too young to be looking after me. You should be spending time with people your own age, Lena. You're not getting any younger." Lena's smile faltered, and she looked away, focusing on the picture hanging on the wall. It was a photo of her late mother and father, taken at their wedding. They looked so young, so full of life. Lena's heart twisted at the thought of her mother, who had passed away 5 years ago. She had promised her mother she would care for George, that she would never leave him alone. But what about her own life? What about her own happiness? She couldn't afford to think about that now. Not with George's health continuing to deteriorate, not with her responsibilities mounting every day. But as she sat down beside her father's chair and they ate together, Lena's thoughts kept drifting back to Jake. The way he looked at her, the way he made her feel. Alive. She hadn't felt this way in so long, hadn't felt seen, hadn't felt desired. She had always prided herself on being strong, independent, and practical, but it was hard to ignore the pull she felt toward him. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next as Lena fell deeper into the rhythm of caring for her father. Jake was always there, always offering a helping hand or a kind word, and each day the connection between them seemed to grow, subtle and undeniable. At times, Lena would catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, and it made her heart flutter in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. One evening, after George had gone to bed, Lena found herself alone in the kitchen, preparing a late meal for herself. She was lost in thought, her hands moving mechanically as she sliced vegetables, when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. "Need any help?" Jake's voice came from the doorway, low and casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lena turned to face him, her breath catching in her throat. He was standing there in the doorway, the soft light from the kitchen casting shadows on his face. There was something different in his expression, something that made her pulse race. He wasn't just offering help anymore. There was something more in his gaze, something that made her feel vulnerable. "I'm fine," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "You don't need to be here, Jake. You've done enough already." But Jake took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I want to be here. I want to help you, Lena." Lena's heart skipped a beat. There it was again, his voice, his words, his presence. She could feel it all over again, the electric pull between them, the way he made her feel seen in a way no one else ever had. It was dangerous, so dangerous, but it was also undeniable. "Jake, we can't," Lena whispered, her voice trembling slightly. This is wrong." Jake's gaze softened, and he took another step closer. "What if it's not?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's just two people who care about each other?" Lena's breath hitched, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were closing in around them. She was so close to him now, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the slight movement of his chest as he breathed. "You don't understand," Lena said, stepping back, breaking the moment. "I can't do this. I have too many responsibilities. I have a life here. You're too young. And this is not right." Jake didn't move. He simply watched her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It doesn't feel wrong to me," he said quietly. "It feels like we're just two people who need each other. We're not hurting anyone." Lena closed her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this wasn't something she could just ignore. The feelings were too strong, too real. She had spent so many years burying her own desires, burying everything that didn't fit into her carefully constructed life. But with Jake, it was different. He made her feel alive again. But was it worth the risk? The early morning light filtered through the dusty window blinds, casting slivers of golden warmth over the kitchen. Ellie stood at the counter, carefully chopping vegetables for the stew she planned to make later in the day. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floors beneath her feet. A cup of coffee sat beside her, steam rising in the stillness of the room. It was a peaceful morning, just like any other. But everything had changed 2 weeks ago. The day her life, her world, had cracked open. Ellie had always been a woman who prided herself on keeping things orderly. She ran a tight ship, managing her home with efficiency, her work with precision, and her family with love. At 57, she had lived a life filled with challenges, joys, and the occasional heartbreak, but nothing had ever truly shaken her. That is, until her daughter, her only daughter, Claire, had come to visit with a secret. Claire had always been the wild one, the free spirit who would disappear for weeks at a time, never following the typical path her mother had laid out for her. Ellie, ever the pragmatist, had always been the anchor to Claire's stormy life. She had watched Claire chase dreams, break hearts, and then start over again. Ellie had accepted it, if only because Claire had always come back. But that last visit, when Claire had sat at the kitchen table with a weary look in her eyes, had been different. She had hesitated before speaking, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her coffee cup. "I'm pregnant, Mom," Claire had said, her voice small. Ellie's heart had stopped for a moment. Her mind had raced through 1,000 scenarios, none of them good. Claire, prégnant. She wasn't even married, hadn't shown any signs of wanting a family. Ellie had opened her mouth to speak, but the words hadn't come. "I don't know what to do," Claire had continued, her voice trembling. I don't even know who the father is." That had been the moment everything changed. Ellie had tried to hide her shock, tried to remain the calm and steady presence Claire needed. But the truth had hung heavy in the air. Claire had always made questionable decisions, but this was different. This was life-changing. "I'm here for you, Claire," Ellie had said, though her voice had faltered slightly. "We'll figure this out." But how? Ellie didn't know how to fix this. She had always tried to keep her daughter safe, to keep her grounded. Yet, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. For the first time, Ellie wasn't sure how to be a mother. She didn't know how to help Claire with this mess. Now, 2 weeks had passed, and Ellie still hadn't fully processed everything. Claire had decided to keep the baby, even though she hadn't figured out who the father was. The uncertainty loomed over their conversations, and Ellie could see the weight of it in Claire's eyes every time they spoke. Ellie had tried to talk to her husband, George, about it, but he had always been more focused on his work, often retreating into the garage for hours on end. Ellie wasn't angry with him. He had always been distant, not in a cruel way, but in a way that made Ellie feel like she had to handle everything on her own. And now this was no different. As Ellie stirred the stew, she thought about her own life. At 57, she was nearing the twilight years, or so it seemed. She had worked hard, raised her daughter with love and care, and had stayed faithful to her marriage, even when things had grown cold between her and George. But now, with Claire's pregnancy, Ellie felt like she was being forced to confront things she had long ignored in her own life, things that were too painful to acknowledge. George had never been an emotional man, and Ellie had long since learned to live without expecting deep conversations or romantic gestures. Their marriage had settled into a comfortable routine of quiet evenings, simple meals, and shared responsibilities. They didn't fight, but they didn't connect either. It was as if they were both just going through the motions, drifting along with no real sense of direction. But now, with the news of Claire's pregnancy, Ellie couldn't help but feel like something was missing in her own life. She had dedicated herself to being a mother and a wife, but what had she done for herself? She had sacrificed her own desires, her own dreams, all in the name of responsibility. And now, she wondered if that had been the right choice. The doorbell rang, interrupting Ellie's thoughts. She glanced at the clock. Claire was early. She wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the door, a tight knot forming in her stomach. "Hi, Mom," Claire said when Ellie opened the door. She was standing on the porch, a bag slung over her shoulder and a strained smile on her face. Ellie stepped aside to let her in, her mind racing with the words she had yet to find. "Hi, sweetie. How are you feeling today?" Ellie asked, her voice gentle but tinged with concern. Claire shrugged, but Ellie could see the fatigue in her daughter's eyes. The past 2 weeks had been hard on Claire, and Ellie knew that her daughter was struggling to keep it all together. Ellie had tried to be there for her, but she still wasn't sure how to help. "I'm okay," Claire said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I've been trying to figure things out. You know, about everything." Ellie nodded, her chest tight. She didn't know how to respond. How could she, when she didn't have the answers either? She had spent her life trying to give Claire everything she needed, but this was something Ellie couldn't fix. The silence between them grew heavy, and Ellie's mind began to wander. What had happened to her own dreams, her own desires? She had spent so many years focusing on being the perfect mother, the perfect wife, but now, with the weight of Claire's pregnancy hanging over them, Ellie couldn't help but wonder if she had lost herself along the way. "Can we talk about something, Mom?" Claire's voice cut through Ellie's thoughts, pulling her back to the present. Ellie turned her gaze back to her daughter, who was now sitting on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Of course, sweetie. What's on your mind?" Claire hesitated for a moment before speaking, her words slow and deliberate. I don't know what to do about the father. I mean, I don't even know who he is." Ellie's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "Have you tried talking to anyone from that time? Anyone who might know?" Claire shook her head. "I don't even know where to start. I feel like I'm stuck, Mom, and I don't want to feel like this anymore." Ellie sat down beside Claire, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I know, sweetie. I know it's hard, but we'll figure this out together. We always have." But even as she said the words, Ellie felt a pang of uncertainty. How could she promise Claire something when she wasn't even sure of the answer herself? What if Claire couldn't find the father? What if the truth was even more complicated than they could imagine? A few days later, Ellie found herself standing in front of the mirror, her hand resting on her stomach. She had never been one to dwell on the past, but with everything that was happening with Claire, Ellie couldn't help but wonder how her own life might have turned out differently. If she had taken more chances, followed her own dreams, what would her life look like now? She caught a glimpse of her reflection, noticing the lines that had started to form around her eyes and mouth. At 57, she was beginning to see the physical signs of age, the years of worry and responsibility etched into her skin. But beneath it all, there was something more, a quiet yearning for something she had long since pushed aside. Her phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting her thoughts. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was Claire. "Mom, I need you," the message read. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She quickly grabbed her coat and headed out the door, her mind racing. What was happening now? What had Claire gotten herself into? When Ellie arrived at Claire's apartment, her daughter was pacing nervously in the living room. Her eyes were wide, her face pale with worry. "What's wrong?" Ellie asked, rushing toward her. "I think I know who the father is," Claire said, her voice shaking. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. Could it be? Could this be the answer they had been searching for? "I need you to come with me," Claire continued. "I don't want to do this alone." Ellie nodded, taking a deep breath. Whatever happened next, she knew she couldn't let her daughter face it alone. They were in this together. Familiar smell of cinnamon and freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen. The soft sound of a bird's song, just outside the window, adding a layer of peace to the early morning stillness. Janet was in the kitchen, moving with practiced ease as she prepared the breakfast, her hands deftly cracking eggs into a bowl, her mind wandering. She was 57 now, a year older than the age when her mother had passed, a year of self-reflection, but there was still so much she hadn't done. It was the stillness of her home that made her restless sometimes. Even though it was her favorite place, the space she'd filled with memories and carefully chosen decorations, it was quiet in a way that echoed through the rooms. She had 2 children, both grown now, each with their own lives to live. And her husband? Well, he had been gone 5 years, and with him, the loud laughter that used to fill this house. The loudness was replaced by the soft rhythm of her own presence in the house, the tick of the clock, the soft sizzle of bacon frying in the pan. Her eyes wandered toward the corner of the kitchen where a faded family photo sat, her husband Jim, and their 2 kids, Rachel and Henry, on a beach in Florida, laughing under the warmth of the sun. She smiled, remembering that trip, how they'd all been so carefree then. But time had a way of sneaking up on you, changing things you thought would always stay the same. The doorbell rang suddenly, sharp and unexpected, pulling Janet from her thoughts. She wiped her hands on the apron tied loosely around her waist, adjusting it with one quick tug before walking to the front door. Standing on the other side of the door was a man, taller than her husband had been, with a worn cap pulled low over his eyes. His features were rough, but there was something about his presence, something about the way he stood there that made her pulse skip, just for a moment. He held a toolbox in his large hands, his clothes dusty from a long day of work. Janet blinked, surprised at the suddenness of the visit. "Hi, I'm Sean," the man said, his voice rough and quiet, a slight smile on his lips. "I was just in the neighborhood and wanted to offer my services. I noticed your fence was a little loose when I drove by." Janet furrowed her brows. She had no idea what kind of man would just knock on her door out of the blue, offering handyman services. But something about Sean's presence felt different. Maybe it was the gentleness in his voice or the way his eyes lingered, though not overtly. She wasn't sure. "Well, I didn't know it was loose," Janet replied, her hand resting lightly on the doorknob. "But it sounds like something I might need. How much would it cost?" Sean's eyes softened, his lips curling into a small grin. "I'll be honest with you, I'm just looking to make a little extra cash while I'm between jobs. I don't charge a lot, just a few bucks to cover the materials." Janet hesitated. Her instinct was to close the door, but she found herself staring at him, unable to break the gaze. Her heart fluttered, an unfamiliar sensation that she quickly tried to dismiss. She wasn't some young girl, nor was she foolish enough to let a stranger in. But there was something in Sean's demeanor that made her feel like she could trust him, if only just for this one task. "All right," Janet said, finally stepping aside and opening the door wider. "You can come in and take a look." He stepped inside, his boots creaking lightly on the hardwood floor, a slight sense of unease settling over Janet as she led him to the back of the house. As they walked down the hallway, she couldn't help but notice how his presence seemed to fill the space. His shoulders were broad, his movements purposeful yet easy, a certain confidence about him that felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. It was odd how she was drawn to him, considering the age gap and the fact that she had no reason to seek anything from him. When they reached the backyard, Sean walked over to the fence, inspecting the wooden posts that needed repair. Janet stood back, watching him from the doorframe, unsure of what to say or do next. She was alone with him now, and it was only then that she realized how much she had missed the feeling of someone else's presence, someone who wasn't just a memory of her late husband or her distant children. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the yard, bathing everything in a soft, warm light. Janet could feel the change in the air, the weight of it pressing against her as she watched Sean work. He didn't look back at her, but she could feel his attention, his awareness of her standing there. It was a strange connection, one she hadn't felt in years. The last time she had felt this alive was with Jim, before the long stretch of loneliness had settled in after his death. "Well, it looks like the posts are good," Sean said, breaking the silence. "Just needs a few nails and some tightening. I'll have it done in no time." Janet nodded, stepping forward to take a closer look. "Thank you, Sean," she said, her voice suddenly sounding more fragile than she wanted. "I didn't realize it was in such bad shape." "No problem," he replied, the sound of the hammer tapping against the wood filling the space between them. He continued working as Janet watched, her thoughts drifting. For some reason, his presence had unsettled her in a way that she couldn't explain. Maybe it was his calm demeanor, his quiet confidence. Or perhaps it was the way he seemed to fill the air with his energy, making her feel like she was still noticed, still worth something. As the evening wore on, the work on the fence was finished. Sean had completed the job with careful precision, and Janet found herself standing beside him in the fading sunlight, not knowing what to say. She had already paid him for his work, more than he had asked for, and yet the tension between them lingered. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Sean turned to face her, his expression softening. "Anytime, Janet. You take care of yourself, all right?" He nodded at her and began to turn to leave, but as he stepped off the porch, he paused for just a moment, his eyes flicking back to her with an intensity that made Janet's heart race in her chest. "I'll see you around," he said, the words leaving her with a strange sense of longing. And with that, he walked down the driveway, his figure disappearing into the dusk. For a long time, Janet stood there looking after him. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her mind whirling with confusion. She had never expected a visit like this, especially from a man so much younger. And yet, in the brief moment they had spent together, Janet couldn't help but wonder what might have been if she hadn't let so many years slip away unnoticed. As the sun set completely, she stepped back into the house, a feeling of yearning washing over her. Something inside her had shifted. Whether it was the connection she had felt with Sean, or the realization that she had let too many years pass in solitude, she couldn't say. But whatever it was, it had ignited something in her. A small spark, perhaps, but a spark nonetheless. And as she moved toward the kitchen, she couldn't help but wonder just how long it would take before she saw Sean again. The following days passed in a blur, and Janet found herself in the same routine she had lived for years, yet now everything felt different. There was a subtle shift, a quiet awareness of her own desires, something she had suppressed for so long. She couldn't stop thinking about Sean, the way he made her feel alive again, as if she were more than just a caretaker, more than just a mother and a widow. He had been a fleeting presence, yet his impact was undeniable. The tension that had hung in the air between them seemed to linger, coloring her every thought. It wasn't like she was looking for anything, at least not consciously. She had lived her life with a quiet resolve, doing what was necessary, what was expected of her. But now, as the weeks passed, she caught herself imagining conversations with Sean, moments that never happened. She wondered if he would come back to fix something else, to offer a helping hand. She found herself glancing out the window, half expecting to see him walking up the driveway, a toolbox in hand. It was absurd, she told herself. He was just a stranger who'd fixed a fence. But there was something in the way he had looked at her, something that stirred a long-dormant part of her soul. One afternoon, after finishing a routine chore, Janet found herself standing in the kitchen again. The hum of the refrigerator and the clink of utensils were the only sounds in the house. She moved absent-mindedly, her thoughts wandering back to Sean and his quiet smile, the way he made her feel noticed. She had worked so hard to build a life around the needs of others, her children, her late husband, her responsibilities, and had somehow forgotten to care for herself. But now, with Sean's sudden presence, that part of her had been awakened. Just as she was washing the dishes, a soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Her pulse quickened in her chest. Could it be him? She wiped her hands on a towel, her heart beating faster than usual as she made her way to the door. When she opened it, there he was. Sean stood on the porch, looking slightly disheveled but still carrying that quiet energy that seemed to fill the space around him. This time, however, his hands weren't holding a toolbox. Instead, he had a simple bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that grew freely in the fields behind her house. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Sean said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "I thought I'd bring these by. They were growing by the road, and I thought of you." Janet's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had brought her flowers, especially not someone like Sean. She stared at the flowers for a moment, taken aback by the gesture. "Thank you," Janet said, her voice low, as if unsure of how to respond. She took the bouquet from his hands, her fingers brushing against his for just a second longer than necessary. The touch sent a small shock of warmth through her, and she had to swallow the sudden lump in her throat. "I didn't know if you'd like them," Sean continued, his eyes studying her with a hint of uncertainty. "But I wanted to show my appreciation for everything you've done." Janet nodded, her emotions swirling. She hadn't realized until that moment just how much she had missed the simple acts of kindness, the small gestures that made her feel seen. "I appreciate it, Sean. It's very thoughtful of you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Sean shifted on his feet, his gaze falling to the ground for a moment before he met her eyes again. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice quieter now. "About you. About us." Janet's heart raced, but she didn't know how to respond. She had spent so many years keeping herself closed off, and now here was Sean, drawing out something inside her that she hadn't realized was there. "I know I'm probably being forward," Sean said, his face reddening slightly. "But I can't stop thinking about you. And I wanted to know if maybe you'd be open to spending some time together. Maybe. Dinner? Just the two of us." Janet's breath caught in her throat. Dinner? It was simple, it was casual, but it felt like so much more. It wasn't just a dinner. It was a line being crossed, an invitation to something she hadn't allowed herself to imagine in years. "I don't know," Janet murmured, looking down at the flowers in her hands. She had never been one to rush into things, to make decisions without careful thought. But Sean had a way of making her feel something she hadn't in so long, something that felt right, even though it was terrifying. Sean seemed to sense her hesitation. He took a small step back, his hands raised in an apologetic gesture. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have put you on the spot like this. I understand if you don't want to. I wanted to ask." Janet's thoughts raced. What did she want? What was she really feeling? This was so unlike her, so out of character. But a part of her, a part she hadn't listened to in years, was telling her to take the chance. To step out of the small, safe box she had built for herself and see what might happen. "I'll think about it," Janet said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "I'm not sure I'm ready to take that step." Sean nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "I understand. No pressure, Janet. Just know that if you change your mind, I'll be here." With that, he turned to leave, his footsteps light on the porch as he walked down the driveway. Janet stood in the doorway, watching him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been one to take risks, to step outside her comfort zone, but something about Sean made her feel like maybe, just maybe, it was time. The next few days were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Janet found herself thinking about Sean more than she expected. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see his face, the way he smiled at her, the way his presence filled the air. It was all so new, so foreign, yet so intoxicating. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Janet found herself standing by the window, staring out at the darkening world. She didn't know what she was waiting for. She wasn't sure what the right choice was. But she knew that she couldn't keep living in this limbo, trapped between what was safe and what was unknown. And so, with a deep breath, she picked up the phone. "Sean," she said when he answered, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been thinking about your offer, and I'd like to take you up on that dinner. If you're still interested." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Sean's voice came through, warm and surprised. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Janet said, her heart racing. "I'd like to see where this could go." And with that, the decision was made. Janet wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was making a choice for herself. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of something she had waited a lifetime to find. When she hung up the phone, Janet let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She walked over to the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with new eyes. She wasn't the same woman she had been before. She was more than the wife, the mother, the caretaker. She was Janet, a woman who was finally willing to take a step into the unknown. And for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. Maggie sat by the window, the weight of everything settling on her shoulders. The evening sky outside her house bled into deep hues of purple and gold, a reflection of the transition she herself was going through. Her life, once neatly organized and predictable, was now chaotic in the best way. The past few months had been a whirlwind, And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The sound of the door creaking open behind her broke her reverie. Maggie turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Ethan step into the room. His presence had become a steady, grounding force in her life, something she never expected, and certainly never planned for. But here they were, sitting together, talking about everything and nothing, weaving their lives together in small, tender ways. He had come by, not to take control or fix things for her, but simply to be with her. That was what Maggie appreciated most, his calm understanding, his ability to be present without overwhelming her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice warm and comforting. "You doing all right?" She smiled at him, the kind of smile that held 1,000 unspoken words. She nodded, but the heaviness that had clung to her earlier in the week had been replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. It wasn't perfect, but nothing ever was. "I'm better," Maggie replied, her voice carrying a sincerity that touched Ethan. "And I think I finally see the path forward." Ethan walked over and sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. There was no rush between them, no need for grand declarations. Their connection had deepened, and while it was still fragile in some ways, it felt stronger than anything she had known in a long time. Maggie looked out the window again, watching the last light of day fade into the horizon. She felt a sense of peace, of acceptance. What had happened, what had begun as something complicated and uncertain, had transformed into something beautiful, something real. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of fear. But through it all, Maggie had discovered more about herself than she ever thought possible. She had learned to trust her own instincts, to embrace the love and connection that came when she opened herself up to the unknown. As the stars began to twinkle above them, Maggie squeezed Ethan's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled, his eyes soft with affection. "There's no need to thank me. We're in this together." And for the first time in a long time, Maggie believed it. They were in this together, no matter what came next, no matter the twists and turns ahead. It wasn't just about a grand romantic gesture, or solving all their problems. It was about understanding, about holding each other up through the good and the bad, and finding solace in the quiet moments in between. As she leaned her head against his shoulder, Maggie realized something. Life wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment for the perfect person. It was about embracing the mess, the imperfection, and the growth that came from it. And in that moment, Maggie knew she was exactly where she needed to be. Lena stood in her father's room, watching as Jake helped George settle into bed for the night. There was a gentleness in Jake's movements that touched her heart, a kindness that went beyond mere duty. As she observed them, she realized that what she felt for Jake wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something that had grown from watching him care for her father with such genuine compassion. "You're a good man, Jake," George said suddenly, his voice clearer than it had been in weeks. "You remind me of myself when I was younger." Jake smiled, adjusting George's pillows. "Thank you, sir, that means a lot." Lena's heart tightened in her chest. Her father had always been a good judge of character, and hearing him speak so warmly of Jake felt like permission she hadn't known she needed. Later that night, after George had fallen asleep, Lena found Jake in the kitchen, cleaning up from dinner. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow over his features. He looked up when she entered, and the air between them crackled with unspoken words. "Jake," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about what you said." He set down the dish he was washing, turning to face her fully. And I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of what people will think, of what this means, of how it might change everything. But I'm more scared of letting this chance slip away." Jake took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "We don't have to figure everything out right now. We can take it slow, see where it leads." Lena nodded, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I'd like that." Meanwhile, across town, Ellie sat with Claire in a small cafe, watching as her daughter nervously stirred her untouched coffee. They had tracked down the father of Claire's baby, a musician named Marcus who had played at the bar where Claire worked. The meeting had been difficult, but necessary. "He wants to be involved," Claire said, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "He said he'll help however he can." Ellie reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. "That's good news, isn't it?" Claire nodded, finally looking up to meet her mother's eyes. "Mom, I need to tell you something else. Seeing you these past few months, how you've supported me through all this. It's made me realize how much I've taken you for granted." Ellie felt her heart swell with emotion. "Oh, sweetheart." "No, let me finish," Claire insisted. "You've always been there for me. even when I was at my worst. But you never stopped living your own life, never stopped being your own person. That's what I want to learn from you, how to be strong, how to be independent, but also how to let people in. Ellie squeezed her daughter's hand, understanding flowing between them. Sometimes the greatest lessons came from the most unexpected places. Janet stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her dress nervously. Her first dinner with Sean had turned into weekly dates, each one feeling more right than the last. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, she was introducing him to her children. The doorbell rang, and Janet took a deep breath before opening it. Sean stood there, looking handsome in a blazer, holding a bottle of wine and wearing that smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Ready?" he asked, taking her hand. "As I'll ever be," she replied, squeezing his fingers. The dinner went better than Janet could have hoped. Her son Henry and daughter Rachel were initially reserved, but Sean's genuine warmth and respect for their mother won them over. By dessert, they were all laughing together, the age difference forgotten in the warmth of connection and understanding. Later that night, as Sean was preparing to leave, he turned to Janet on the porch. "Your kids are amazing," he said softly. "Just like their mother." Janet felt tears welling up in her eyes. "They liked you," she whispered. "I wasn't sure they would." Sean pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "We're building something real here, Janet. Something that matters." As summer turned to fall, all three women found themselves transformed by the love they had dared to embrace. Lena learned that caring for her father didn't mean sacrificing her own happiness, especially when Jake proved to be not just a lover, but a true partner in all aspects of her life. Claire's baby was born, a healthy girl named Hope, and Ellie discovered that being a grandmother opened up a whole new chapter of joy in her life. Janet and Sean moved in together, creating a home that bridged their age gap with understanding and respect. One warm evening, the three women found themselves sharing a table at a local restaurant, brought together by a mutual friend. As they shared their stories, they discovered the common threads that ran through their experiences: the fear of judgment, the struggle with societal expectations, and the courage it took to choose happiness. "To second chances," Lena proposed, raising her glass. "To love at any age," Janet added. "To being brave enough to start over," Ellie concluded. Their glasses clinked together, the sound ringing with promise and possibility. Each of them had taken a different path, but they had all arrived at the same truth. It was never too late to open your heart to love, to challenge expectations, to begin again. As they left the restaurant that night, walking out into the star-filled evening, each woman felt a deep sense of peace. They had found not just love, but something even more precious: the courage to be true to themselves, to embrace joy when it appeared, and to trust that sometimes the most unexpected turns in life led to the most beautiful destinations.